having a debate in the office about what makes change. Take us through a jaunt through history. Does rage fuel change? Hashtags, quiet diligence, writing submissions to the national wage case on equal pay for women. What makes change?
Well, I think you'd say that fundamentally collective action makes change. You've got to have those strong individuals who become the kind of figureheads of a movement that people can get behind, who can be inspiring through their words or their actions. But fundamentally, it's collective action. And International Women's Day is a wonderful time to remember that, because it's really important to remember that when International Women's Day started in 1911, it was actually called International Working Women's Day. And this was absolutely a day of protest. It was a day of grassroots political activism from an industrial sense for women coming together to protest unequal, unfair, unsafe conditions in their workplaces. And we can lose track of that because International Women's Day, as you're suggesting, has really become quite a kind of corporate hallmark greeting card, little purple ribbon on the badge, that kind of performative allyship with women that belies its roots as being part of a socialist organisation. And it really wasn't until 1975 that changed. So I think that rage is really important. People coming together is really important. But it's collective action with, importantly, a really clear agenda that is what makes fundamental change.
Avia, this is a terrible question without notice to put you on the spot and ask. Who are those inspiring leaders for you, and do you think there's a clear agenda right now? So who are the inspiring women at the top of this, at the leadership of this movement, and is it clear what the agenda is?
Look, I mean, I think to reduce it down to just one single agenda would be misleading, right? I mean, obviously you've got the overarching goal of equality in the end, but along that way you've got all these other smaller steps, and you've got women who exist at the intersections of many different kinds of discrimination. So, for example, women of color or trans women. So then I think each of those needs to be addressed in a very intersectional way without pretending that every woman's struggle is going to be the same, right? And I think for me, the inspiring women that, I looked up to would be, of course, Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, young women who are using their voice and their platform to enact real societal change and sort of speaking truth to power by calling out politicians, by calling out how much further we have to go in terms of real impactful change.
And that's really interesting that you point to those two, because they're not saying, other than saying climate action or equality, but they're making a very detailed critique of the lack of action on climate change that is very accessible for people about what needs to change, and a very detailed assessment from Malala about what are the conditions that ensure that in lots of parts of the world and for lots of women they are very much second-class citizens. But they're not exactly saying, and here's the blueprint, here's the piece of legislation, are they?
Yeah, I think because to boil it down to one single solution would be, sort of overlooking a lot of the intricacies. Because a lot of the, like with climate change, right, a lot of people wouldn't consider that a feminist issue. But since we live in a patriarchal society, a lot of the burdens of climate change are, of course, going to disproportionately affect women and other minorities, right? So I think when they're pointing to these issues specifically where there's been such a gaping lack of action, it's sort of calling on the politicians themselves to make the change, the people at the very top.
It's an interesting one, Claire. If you sort of look at the equal pay case, right, and you say, well, that was, among other people, Edna Ryan, and annual awards are named after Edna. She retires from the workforce, she becomes a member of the Women's Electoral Lobby, and she sits down, presumably at night and presumably without the benefit of a computer, in 1974. And she says, well, here's the submission to the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission of 1974, basically saying why women should have the same wage for the same work, pointing out that, dear sir, there are solo female breadwinners in Australia and you might like to consider that point. And the whole matter turned on that. And so sometimes I wonder whether you need that sort of intricacy, that sort of detailed work to affect change.
Well, I guess one of the most famous cases for equal pay was Zelda Soprano, chaining herself to the front of the Commonwealth Arbitration Buildings in 1969, holding up her equal pay sign. It's become one of the most iconic images in feminist history in Australia. And it is that sort of inspirational action that galvanizes people. And I think that's what those things do. They galvanize people. They become symbolic. They don't necessarily lead directly on to the legislation that's going to change, but they can really spark a movement. And that's exactly what happened in 1969. It was really at the forefront of the women's movement, the second wave women's movement. And the whole Women's Liberation Front came in behind Zelda Soprano and the women who were working with her along in those campaigns. And equal pay became a kind of arrowhead in the debate. But equally, equal pay was part of the agenda of the first wave suffragists. The women who were part of those first widespread International Women's Day demonstrations across Europe in those years, in the 1920s and the 1930s, equal pay was on their agenda. And we still don't have it now. This is unfinished business. I think this is one of the things that we have to, that studying history keeps reminding us. There's no one single moment where things change, and they change irrevocably. There is progress, and there are many, many setbacks along the way. And then we also start to consider perspectives that weren't previously involved, like our much more enlightened version of what feminism means now, a more inclusive, excuse me, a more inclusive debate that's bringing in what's now sometimes called the double glazed glass ceiling. We're familiar with the glass ceiling, but what does it look like if your race or your gender or your sexuality doubly locks you out of those positions of opportunity and of power? So we have to continue to grow and to change within movements to even problematize the notion of woman, but at the same time recognize that ultimately it comes down to power and who has it.
Yeah.
And what we see over and over again is that men have the majority of power, and they don't want to give it up, and they're not going to give it up without a fight.